Ukraine's struggle for freedom dragged the Russian army into the biggest crisis in its history. Especially southern Ukraine has turned into a hell for the Russians because of Kiev's offensive plans. The Russians are trapped in a large area stretching from the southern front lines of Ukraine to the Crimea. It seems that these heavy attacks will continue until the main target of the Ukrainians is liberated: the Crimean Peninsula. For the liberation of Crimea, the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to build a long offensive corridor connecting roads on the southern front lines. For this purpose, the Ukrainian troops had recently taken action, primarily on the Zaporizhia front line. Kiev's grand offensive plans routed the Russian troops in the Zaporizhia region here. The last 9 settlements were liberated from the Russians. However, the fierce attacks of the Ukrainian army still continue in this region. Ukrainian forces aim to advance and liberate the coastline front lines as well as Zaporizhia. In line with this goal, Kiev's next stop was the Russian-controlled port city of Berdyansk. The port city of Berdyansk is very important for both sides of the war. The city has a coast on the Sea of Azov. Here, the Russians aim to involve the Navy in the war and open a strategic front against Kiev. But there's one small detail that Moscow overlooked. The major offensive plans carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces are supported by modern, high-level weapons, missile systems, and combat vehicles provided by the West and the USA. The Ukrainian army is driving these Western vehicles into the field in the city of Berdyansk, as well as on the Zaporizhia front line. Western war vehicles had given the Ukrainian army a large area of dominance in Zaporizhia. Now it's time in Berdyansk, one of the Russian army's strongholds. These vehicles include the German Leopard 2 and the UK-made Challenger battle tanks. These 2 mighty battle tanks are also war beasts that are currently advancing on the Ukrainian Berdyansk front lines. Thanks to these Western tanks, the Ukrainian armed forces have now managed to break through the Russian defense on the Berdyansk front line by 2 kilometers. The Russians have their third army established after the first mobilization in Berdyansk, Melitopol, and on the left bank of the Dnipro, along with units from the senior 22nd Army and the 1st Elite Guard Army in these regions. The Russian army established a very serious defense line in about 14 months. Russian military bases, airports, and logistics routes were created. However, we see that none of them could withstand the attack by Ukraine. A month ago, the first line of defense of the Russian army was broken here, and now the Ukrainian forces are crossing the second line of defense. Leopard 2 and Challengers, which have incredible functions in terms of armor and maneuverability, are building a safe corridor for Ukrainian infantry units in Berdyansk. Thanks to the successful artillery fire of these Western tanks, the Ukrainian forces can easily reach the Russian trenches in Berdyansk, and the Ukrainian troops advancing from the land can see that the Russian soldiers in this direction have already been neutralized. In other words, Ukrainian troops advancing from the land line are conducting more reconnaissance and detection operations in Berdyansk. The British Challenger and German Leopard battle tanks undertake most of the work. The city of Berdyansk was one of the most trusted front lines of the Russians, but the Russian defense in Berdyansk was useless. The fortifications in this city, which Putin praised, almost collapsed thanks to the Western tanks used by the Ukrainians. Valery Churkin, spokesman for the Joint Press Center of the Torai Direction Defense Forces, said that the advance of the Ukrainian army in the south is getting more and more violent with each passing day. In addition, Valery Churkin announced that the Ukrainian armed forces systematically put pressure on certain parts of the front, broke through the defenses of the Russian army in the southern trenches, and destroyed its positions. Western tanks in the inventory of the Ukrainian army on the front lines, such as those at Berdyansk, Melitopol and Zaporizhia contributed greatly to the attack plans of Kiev because the Russian army lost about 4,000 battle tanks and Ukraine westernized and modernized its inventory. The Russian army doesn't seem to have much of a chance in this regard. So how did Ukraine make such serious progress in Berdyansk, one of Putin's most trusted front lines in the last few days? Of course, the contribution of Western tanks to the progress of Ukraine is quite large, but the Russian troops in and around Berdyansk were curiously unresponsive to this advance by the Ukrainians. The reason for this has been much debated. However, the main reason why the Russians were helpless in this regard was the missile attacks carried out by the Ukrainian army in this city in the past few days. If you remember, the Ukrainians launched 11 Storm Shadow long-range missile attacks on the Russian military base in Berdyansk. The military administration of the city of Berdyansk noted that 11 explosions were heard in the city. Fire was seen in the airspace area, and the sound of an explosion was heard. In addition, the armed forces of Ukraine officially confirmed that they hit the airspace in temporarily occupied Berdyansk. As a result of these mind-blowing attacks, the Russians lost their main headquarters in Berdyansk and their fuel and mineral oil depots. Russian attack helicopters and drones were recorded by satellites at the Berdyansk airport. Planet Labs satellite specifically detected Kar-52, Mi-8 or Mi-24 attack aircraft and 13 Kar-29 ship transporters. There were a total of 27 helicopters belonging to the Russian army at the airport. It was claimed that these aircraft were damaged as a result of the Storm Shadow missile attacks by the Ukrainian army and that the Russians carried these warplanes and helicopters to much more secure areas. For this reason, the Russian troops had to surrender to the 2 km advance of the Ukrainian army in Berdyansk with the Leopard and Challenger Western battle tanks. If Kiev maintains this advantage and the Ukrainian armed forces completely seize control of the southern front lines, including Berdyansk, there will be no obstacles to the liberation of Crimea from the Russians. So in which direction should Ukraine prefer to move forward besides Berdyansk in order to liberate Crimea? And what should be Kiev's approach to Crimea? For the Ukrainian army to reach Crimea and create a connecting corridor to the peninsula, they must seize control of most of the southern front lines. The most strategic area for this is the Kherson region. Most of the control in the region is in the hands of the Ukrainians, but there are still Russian forces in Kherson awaiting, regrouping, and planning attacks on the Ukrainian army. For this reason, the Ukrainian armed forces must completely end the Russian threat in Kherson. Besides Kherson, the Dnipro River region and the Kinburn-Spit Isthmus are among the critical areas the Ukrainians can use attack boat groups in these two regions to repulse the Russians, especially using the connection of the Kinburn-Spit with the Black Sea. Apart from Kherson, Ukrainian forces must also maintain control of front lines such as Melitopol and Tokhmyk for the ground attack corridor in Melitopol. The Ukrainian armed forces had already carried out an attack in the past few days. The main military base area controlled by the Russians in this city was damaged as a result of the offensive operations of the Ukrainians, especially in Zaporizhia. While Kiev's offensive plans continued, the damage to one of the main Russian military bases in Melitopol dealt a heavy blow to Moscow's retaliatory strategies. Since the Russians could not use this military base, they could not provide support to Zaporizhia or the southern lines of Melitopol. In this way, the Ukrainians were one step closer to their plans to save Crimea. Just like the city of Melitopol, Tokhmyk is an important transit point in this corridor extending to the Crimea. Here, mostly Ukrainian partisan groups have suppressed the Russian troops and the Moscow authorities in this region. Therefore, the Russian forces cannot support Zaporizhia from here and cannot prevent the Ukrainians from advancing towards the Crimea. If the Ukrainian forces want to reach the Crimea, besides all this, they have to continue this war strategy until Novotroitsky. In addition, the Crimean border centers near this city are among the places that Ukrainians should control. For example, Berdyansk city between the Crimea and the Ukraine border lines is a very suitable settlement for the main purpose of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian army is currently conducting an incredible operation in the city of Bakhmut, while a south-oriented great offensive breakthrough was expected from the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian special forces started counterattacks in Bakhmut and the surrounding areas. Ukrainian troops are also supporting the Bakhmut operation in the town of Shasavar, 17 kilometers west of the city. Ukrainian artillery units are also involved in this major operation on the Kromov front line, about 20 kilometers northwest of Bakhmut. Ivanitsky countryside on the southwest lines of Bakhmut is also one of the fronts that the Ukrainians actively use as the supply zone for operations in Bakhmut. Already, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar had stated on Telegram on June 5 that Ukrainian forces were successfully advancing in the direction of Bakhmut along a fairly broad front. Looking at today, we can see that the Ukrainian forces continue this successful advance. One of the reasons for this appears to be the Wagner Group leaving the trenches around the city of Bakhmut. Even days after Russia's Wagner Group forces withdrew from Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, its commander, Yevgeny Prigozhin, made it clear that the city was no longer under Russian control. These statements revealed that the Russians had lost Bakhmut and that the Ukrainians had gained ground in this city. Commander Prigozhin also stated that with the order of Lieutenant Colonel Roman Venevitinov, the commander of the 72nd Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian Army, the Russian troops opened fire on the Wagner mercenaries, and a war vehicle used by the mercenary group was damaged under this fire. The situation in Bakhmut intensifies as the Russian army fills the areas with minefields in Bakhmut and detonates them as Wagner forces pass this road. Friendly fire between Russian and Wagner forces solidifies the Ukrainian advance in Bakhmut. In addition, the departure of troops led by Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov from the southern parts of Bakhmut confirmed Prigozhin's statements on the southern front lines of Bakhmut are the special forces of the Ukrainian army, especially now. Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, also known as the Azov Regiment, has blockaded Bakhmut, its southern trench lines up to Opytny. In these areas, we can see that the Russians could not get out of the trenches and retreated. In addition to the Azov Regiment, the soldiers of Ukraine's 93rd Mechanized Brigade, again in the southern parts of Bakhmut, appear as one of the special forces supporting active offensive operations. The Wagner Group remained passive in these areas, and the Russian troops retreated from the trenches around Bakhmut. As Ukraine continued to intensify offensive operations, Wagner commander Prigozhin described it as embarrassing, noting that Ukrainian forces had retaken parts of the Barvika settlement north of Bakhmut. Russian Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov and Defense Minister Shoigu had reunited and stopped their forces along the Burkovsky Reservoir. But this decision was completely ineffective with the artillery attacks and trench clashes of the Ukrainians. Heavy clashes took place in Bergkirk. The Ukrainians entered this settlement with artillery attacks and infantry units and captured a large part of the city. The capture of Bergkirk is of vital importance to the Ukrainian forces. The strategic location of the city is very important. The settlement of Bergkirk, about 26 kilometers from Bakhmut, serves as a bridge to the Luhansk front lines. Therefore, by seizing this place, The Ukrainians closed the passage and connection roads of the Russians between Bakhmut and Luhansk. Currently, it is estimated that the Ukrainian armed forces have created an attack corridor of approximately 138 kilometers between Verkhovka and Luhansk. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin emphasizes that with the loss of Markivka, Russian troops will be pushed back to Luhansk. In fact, when we look at this situation from a broad perspective, it is understood that the statements of the Wagner leader are correct. Russian troops in Krasnaya Gora, about 10 kilometers northeast of Markivka, are also now at risk. Clashes had been going on here for several weeks. However, with the capture of Berwick by the Ukrainians, the Russian attacks in Krasnaya Gora decreased visibly in the town of Solidar, about 20 kilometers northeast of Berdyansk. Things are much more complicated because we know that Wagner troops were in this city. The Ukrainian offensive corridor stretches as far as the salt mines in solidarity with the capture of Berdyansk by the Ukrainians. Kiev continues to carry out its offensive operation plans through Solidar. The 137th Air Assault Regiment of the Russian Army is also located here. But the Russian Airstrike Regiment is not effective enough to lessen the Ukrainian pressure on Solidar. The Russians are also considering pulling the 106th Air Assault Division from Krasnohorivka towards the city of Solidar. This is because Russians wanted to create a much more solid defensive fortification. In addition, the Ukrainians, after taking Verkhovka, could advance to Krasnaya Gora, inflicting heavy losses on the Russian forces. Therefore, the shifting of the 106th Air Assault Division of the Russian Army from Krasnaya Gora to Solidar will perhaps prevent the destruction of this division. But the Ukrainians have advanced as far as Solidar and have increased the intensity of their attacks considerably. Western military support also contributes significantly to the offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces in these areas. On the other hand, the Russian defense does not seem to be effective for long due to the lack of military resources. Therefore, Wagner commander Prigozhin urged Shoigu and Gerasimov to be in the foreground much more because of all these negative situations. The friction between the Wagner leader and Russian officials gives the Ukrainian armed forces much more ground, both at Bakhmut and on other fronts in the Donetsk, Luhansk regions, because as we mentioned, we said that the Ukrainians continued their effective offensive operations on the front lines in Luhansk after capturing Bereshivka. The Russians, on the other hand, tried to organize an offensive operation against the Ukrainians on the Kremenna front line a few days ago to counter this situation. But these attempts were unsuccessful. In fact, the Russians act more cautiously in the ground battles in the Luhansk region than in the Donetsk region fronts. They use artillery much more, but the Russians' attacks result in their losses and retreat. Alexei Smirnov, deputy head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration, summed up this situation very well in his statement on Telegram. The biggest news is coming from the Zaporizhia region. As expected, the Russians tried to launch yet another offensive operation, attacked Volodar, which turned out to be the most difficult operation that the southern Russian forces had done. The irretrievable losses are already counted in thousands per day, which means that the Russians are burning their reserves at an extremely rapid pace. Yesterday I told you that because the Russian offensive operation around Orikhiv had failed, the Russians started shifting their focus to other regions of the Zaporizhia front line. I also told you that judging by the actions of the Russians, I expect the Russians to launch the offensive operation around Volodar within one day. And this is exactly how it happened. The reason why Russian offensive actions here were largely predictable is that the Russians simultaneously moved their forces into the outskirts of the settlements that they control. Usually the outskirts are kept empty to leave some buffer zone. So eliminating this buffer zone simultaneously shows that the enemy is shortening the distance along all possible axes of advance. And today they moved precisely along this axis. The main direction of the attack became the eastern outskirts of Volodar. The reason why the Russians chose to put the most effort into this vector is twofold. First of all, as you can see, Volodar consists of two parts: the city and a small country set across the road. Secondly, if you look at the topographic map, we can see that this countryside is located on the same hill as the city, which means that if the Russians establish their positions there, at least they will be storming high-rise buildings from the same elevation. The Russians launched their artillery preparation with the main focus of pushing the Ukrainians from the outer edges of the countryside in order to create an opportunity for the attack group to establish a toehold. The attack group quickly moved in and immediately engaged in positional fights. The second group made a supporting attack from Pavlivka, and the normal circumstance is storming Ukrainian trenches in front of Volodar would be suicide operation. But the Russians moved in their thermobaric artillery and started burning the hospitals on the corner under cover of smoke and devastating fire. The Russians managed to advance by up to 400 meters. This is insignificant in this case, and they will likely be tied to Thrilianesian. But as it is a supporting attack, the main goal is not to make a breakthrough, but to draw attention and fix some forces, which they are doing. By the evening, the momentum was broken and the fights became positional. The Ukrainians have also reinforced this region with heavy equipment, even though the Russians cut off all highways leading to Volodar. There are still several dirt roads to the north, which are short and given the below-zero temperatures can be used with no problems. Ukrainian attack groups did not even need the roads, as they were advancing along the tree belts on Russian positions and firing at them from multiple tanks. So far, there are only two visible results of this offensive operation. The Ukrainians lost the countryside and the Russians lost a lot of troops. In fact, since the Russians launched their offensives along the whole Zaporizhzhia front, their losses skyrocketed. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Russian losses over the last day amounted to almost 4,000 soldiers, 910 killed, and 2,730 wounded. And this does not include the massacre that took place today around Volodar, although it does include the Russian sabotage group that got destroyed near Kherson. The silence of the low activity in the region was broken recently by a company of Russian soldiers that tried to cross the Dnipro River near Potyomkin Island. As mentioned previously, the Ukrainians established tight sniper control over this area because there are a lot of houses and the Russians could quickly appear and try to carry out a certain mission. When it comes to the areas that are located deeper in the Russian-controlled territories, the Russians are arrayed in museums. According to a recent publication, more than 30 museums in the south unfortunately came to their attention, in particular those in Mariupol, Melitopol, but also Kherson before its liberation.